003 video, Postmodern Kabbalah Human Science 101, TexMex-Pecan Seed-of-Life Model of Creation. This is dedicated to the B'nai Anusim, children of the coerced. Let's take it from the very top. All things that are in the process of becoming, meaning that they're developing in time. Things develop from a time equal to zero, such that in order to understand them, we pretty much have to know their beginning. All things have a beginning, lowercase b, because there is a beginning, uppercase b. We don't have to know the beginnings of all things. Suffice that we know the beginning of things. The Kabbalah does precisely this. It studies the creation story as it appears in the book Bereshit, Genesis, verses 1:1 to 2:3. By the way, Bereshit literally means in head of, which translates as in beginning of. But the Kabbalah itself is in time. Therefore, it is in the process of permanently becoming what it is. It must change in order to remain the same. To our understanding, being the case that we ourselves are in the process of becoming what we are. The last time it came in for maintenance was back during medieval times, some 1500 years ago. Its checkup is long overdue. It's time for an update. The creation story is the indispensable condition for figuring a way out of floundering in the maze. If anything does, it, above and beyond anything else, takes us to the source and provides us the cues. Things in time develop from a time equal to zero. In order to understand things, you pretty much have to go to absolute time equal to zero. It is so self-evident that it is a truism. No need for further abundance. Let's start by doing the whole triad of what, how, and why of the Kabbalah reception. Later on, we'll unfold things for a better view, but one is first, and so let's start at the beginning. What is Kabbalah reception? The upshot is that Kabbalah is the reception of the tradition coming down through the ages from the revelation of the Torah teaching to Moses at Mount Sinai. More specifically, it refers to the study of the Maseh Bereshit, work of creation, as found in Bereshit, Genesis, verses 1:1 to 2:3. That's it. That's all there is to it. Let's not lose sight of the forest on account of the trees. How do we relate to the Kabbalah? Again, on the one hand, you need all you can get your hands on, and on the other hand, all you need is just yourself. Yes, seek counsel from rabbis, scholars, priests, and other sources, but solely as scaffolding. For at the end of the day, simply sit down attentively and be at one with the text, and you'll be well on your way to keychain reenacting the work of creation. As the blessing says when studying it, la'asok bedivrei Torah, engross in the words of the teaching. Start at the beginning. Commence by studying the letter number Aleph 1, A1, for therein lies primeval common sense, that the whole is triad, that ultimately all is 3 in 1. Why study Kabbalah? This has to do directly with who we are. We are Homo sapiens, being of wisdom, of sapiens. There is a human science hardwired in our hearts from get-go. This cornerstone primeval common sense of Holy Triad has been overlooked ever since it was given to Moses. On the timeline moving backwards, we have to thank Newton for blindsiding us with a helmet of the scientific method for reducing what to how, leaving why unaddressed. Stupid is as stupid does. Modern science is hollow at its core. The square pardes of the Kabbalists, the elliptical dialogue of Socrates, and before him the complex right triangle of Pythagoras can all be traced back to Moses. But for some reason or other, none of these representations caught on. They were all misunderstood by label thinking, and now yours truly rediscovers it, hoping this time around things are ripe for receiving it. So then, herein I will be talking about postmodern Kabbalah, about the TexMex-Pecan Seed-of-Life model of creation. I will prove that the Seed-of-Life model maps one-on-one with the classical one of the Tree of Life model that we're more accustomed to viewing. This means that they are equivalent representations of the same study of creation. They called it the work of creation. We now know it as a creation story. The difference being that the most recent is more user-friendly, more human science over occult science. and most importantly, with immediate numerous applications to the real world. The story goes as follows. It all started or ended with my book, the one I wrote, Pardesism Human Science 101, with a lengthy subtitle that tells the tale, namely, Pardes Primevalism, Treeseeding Our Original Common Sense on the Bible's Creation Story, verses 1 to 2-3, Universal World Reconstitution from Crisis City to Paradise Earth. In following, I will establish the identification between postmodern Kabbalah and classical Kabbalah, leaving the personal narrative and accompanying arguments till later. If we run out of time, we'll follow up with a sequel to this video, and maybe, if there's a following, a whole series of Postmodern Kabbalah Human Science 101 to showcase the message piecemeal. Some of the following slides are taken directly from my book mentioned above, while others have been made expressly for this presentation. The first slide compares and contrasts the postmodern Kabbalah model with the classical Kabbalah model of creation. Since this is pretty straightforward, in any case, let me go one by one. This is compare and contrast the postmodern seed of life and the classical tree of life Kabbalah. So on the first column, we have the concept, and then we have the postmodern seed of life, and then here we have the classical tree of life. Seed and tree, you know, the chicken and egg thing, okay? Okay, so the source, both source from the Genesis creation story, verse 1 to 2-3. So we're talking about the same thing. The name, as I said, we call it now creation story. Back then, they called it work of creation. Today, we call it Human Science 101. Back then, it was called occult science. This occult comes from that science was positive. And anything that is not positive is negative, which is occult. But occult got a bad rap. So in any case, today is Human Science 101. Back then, it was occult science. What is the takeaway? What is the takeaway lesson? Because it comes from the Torah, which means teaching. So what is the takeaway? In our case of the postmodern seed of life, it is Aleph 1, okay, or A1. In the classical, it is not clear to me what is the takeaway. The difficulty, well, this one, the postmodern, is easy to understand. The classical one, I think it's hard. The theme, ours, is simple. The classical one is very complicated. What is the finality? Well, in the postmodern, it's practical. Okay? It's about solving our world problems, the mess we're in, about not letting go to waste our crises, our perfect crises. The classical, it gives me the impression that it was more speculative, okay? More deeper stuff, you know? Now, who can study it? Ours, anybody can, you know, if you can pay attention, you can study it. Back then, men only, obviously. Over 40, not younger, okay, married and so on. They had to be captains of 50, whatever that meant. And they had to be scholars, I mean, really deep guys. Now, what is it? Well, the postmodern is the triad, the whole is triad parts, all is 3 in 1. The classical calls it Pardes, which is PRDS. That's an acronym that is all is 4-tiered. So it's the same thing. The whole is creation, represented in our case with a square, as we'll see later on. And back then it was called Pardes or Paradise. Okay, and the ellipse in our representation corresponds to life, and back then correspond to secret, or what we would call division by 0, which is not permitted because it takes you someplace else. And the vertical imaginary axis, because we use a complex right triangle for the human being, for us, the vertical will be the spirit, and the classical corresponds to Derish, discover. The hypotenuse corresponds to the mind, and theirs to Remes, remit, and our horizontal corresponds to the body or the physical, and there was Peshat, but it's basically the same idea. Now that we've done the above comparison between the new and the older versions of the same thing, this next slide starts by presenting the classical array configuration of the 10 Sefirot numbers and the 22 Otiot letters. Though there have been various array configurations of the classical version, the standard follows Aryeh, lion, though his name is anglicized as Ari or Ari. So this is basically the idea. This is the array, the 10 little balls. They used to be, the middle one used to be shifted up, and now it's shifted down. And now you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If you shift it up like the way it used to be, you would have to go back, and that messed it up. So this is the latest version of the classical Kabbalah. Now comes the postmodern Kabbalah version, which is the one we came up with, which really needs no introduction, since this is what we've been using all along in my book and elsewhere in the videos and podcasts. However, at one point I became aware that there existed a disconnect between, on the one hand, what I was talking about, that the whole is triad and all is one and so on, and on the other hand, the greater tradition of the creation story. I must confess that it took me some time to reach this realization, but once there, this presentation was needed to make the identification in the public's mind. In other words, I came up with this thing, triads and so on, and on the other hand, there's the Kabbalah, and nobody knows what triad was, and everybody knows what Kabbalah is, and but they're the same thing because they are studies of the work of creation, of the creation story, so they're the same thing. But I needed to make the connection, and that's the purpose of this video. So then, this is the postmodern Kabbalah Seed-of-Life model of creation. As you can see, we come up with the seed of life, like a pecan. The pecan is made up of a husk. This is the husk, this is the shell, and this is the kernel. Okay, and basically what it says is that out of creation comes life. And it is one, but it is 3 in 1. This is the spirit corresponding to the imaginary axis, the body, the horizontal axis, and the mind, second story standing on the shoulders, so to speak, of body and spirit. As far as language goes, we make sense because it's a triad as well. Language is one thought made up of what? Subject, object or adjective, and verb. Same thing. So everything is 3 in 1, and that's the take-home message, that whole is a triad and all is 3 in 1. So the above represents the TexMex-Pecan Seed-of-Life model of creation in a nutshell. The next step is to close the gap between this postmodern model and the classical configuration that we've all grown accustomed to viewing. The triad in turn unfolds into a triad of triads. Once this is done, the identification is clear. For now, we have 10 parts corresponding to the 10 parts of the classical version. This we exhibit above. So as you can see in the previous one, if you just look at this, and then you look at the classical one, there are 10 things and all that, and here there are only 3, and it's not very clear what is the connection. But if you, each one of these sides, turn it into a triad in term, then you get a triad of triad. This is the triad, this is the triad of triads, and now you got 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and this is 10. And guess what? You have 10 as well on the other side. So the whole idea is that there is an equivalence between this part, okay, and this part. That's the whole point of this. Now, the point of this next one is that the array tree of life configuration is equivalent to the TexMex-Pecan Seed-of-Life model, both representations of creation. By the way, the TexMex-Pecan, I call it like that because the pecan is actually native to Texas and Mexico, okay? So I thought it was adequate to be calling it TexMex-Pecan. Okay, so both are equally studies on the Maseh Bereshit work of creation, today better known as creation story, as found in Bereshit Genesis verses 1, 2, 2, 3. It should come as no surprise that both should be equivalent representations of reality or of creation. Now, one thing I need to make you notice between the classical and this one, there are 2 differences between the classical Adi tree of life array and the one pictured below. It's different. As you can see it here, see the little connecting lights, the lines, which are the otiot corresponding to the letters. So these are the 10 numbers, and the lines are the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. As you can see, This one is the classical one, the Ari, and the one we're putting here is a bit different, okay? The connection is different, and I'll tell you in a second why, okay? So there are two differences. However, there are two differences between the classical Ari tree of life array and the one picture below that we call the seed tree of life hybrid, obviously, because we're combining seed tree. Instead of seed on one hand and tree on the other, this is a seed tree hybrid array configuration. One difference obeys a triad of triad compliancy. That is, the original Ari doesn't meet the requirement that is 22 Otiot letters adequately connecting the tensifidot, such that these in turn form triads of their own that are intertwined, namely the triad of triads out of the main triad. See, here we have one triad, here we have another triad, and here we have another triad, and each of these triads corresponds to this one here, and this one here. Whereas the classical version, recall, has a very different arrangement, okay? It was not triad compliant, okay? Now, the second difference refers to nomenclature. All the names of the postmodern version are restricted to the same creation story, verses 1, 1 to 2, 3, whereas the classical version takes them from other sources, and in my opinion, they are heavily influenced by Greek conceptualization. Not that there's anything wrong with Greek thought, obviously, but rather that Greek thought itself is a later development of Israeli thought to begin with. In my humble opinion, the spirit of the work is more aligned with the source nomenclature of the same creation story. Like here, we have Keter, Chokhmah, the classical names, crown, wisdom, understanding, and things like that, which if you read the Torah or the 5 books of Moses, it never talks in those terms, okay? Hardly ever uses those terms. Those terms are more from the prophetic books or from the Haggadah, but not precisely from the Torah, okay? And in my case, with a postmodern, we stick to the classical. In other words, everything that we say comes from the creation story, from 1, 1 to 2, 3, and nothing more, okay? All the names come there, as we will see in a second, okay? So the next slide compares the nomenclatures of the Kabbalah array versions. On the one hand, the classical Ari tree of life array, and on the other hand, the postmodern tree seed of life hybrid array, so to speak. By the way, said in passing, I borrow and use extensively the tool of Pardes from the classical version. This is due mostly to the fact that Pardes maps perfectly one-to-one with a holist triad complex right triangle display. Actually, so much so that it leads the title of my book. Namely, my book is called Pardesism, Human Science 101, and Pardes is certainly a classical Kabbalah idea. To keep things short, this last version of the seed tree of life I denominate below in the slide as Pardes, Paradise, Pecan, Pardes, for purposes of ID and differentiation regarding the classical Ari version. Okay, so that's here we have Keter, which is the classical nomenclature, and on the Pardes we have Breshit, okay? Breshit, and the second one they have Chokhmah, and we have light or Or, and the same thing. So all the names that we have here on the postmodern come directly from each of the emanations of creation, of the acts of creation in the creation story. Whereas the classical one, they bring them from different books of the prophets, and as I said, it's a different can of worms. Okay, I will not dwell much more with the tree of life array, nor with the modified hybrid Pardes seed tree of life array configuration version. There is abundant literature on the subject pretty much everywhere. I will opt instead for further developing the postmodern TexMex-Pecan Seed-of-Life model of creation, given that it is more user-friendly to our modern mindset. This is now displayed below. So this is the one we actually work with in our book and elsewhere, because it's much more intuitive. And basically it says here, okay, so this is the square, the creation, and this is us, and this is equivalent to division by 0, which is secret, it's infinity, so it doesn't, because we live in a finite world, but there's an infinite world as well, and that corresponds to the secret. And I call this the Derash, or spirit, or by language subject, and this would be the the peshat, or the physical, or the object, and this will be the verb, the remit, and so on and so forth. Okay, so from now onwards, we will focus our attention more on the practical hands-on applications, namely the postmodern Kabbalah applications. Reconstitution by the unifying Kabbalah principle of whole is triad, all is three in one, is the order of the day. Don't let this perfect curative crisis go to waste. Let's turn the page of history, once and for all. Pass on the torch from the boomers to the millennials in this relay race of civilization from Crisis City to Paradise Earth. Yours truly, guys, Ricardo, and God bless.